It's important to recognize that the areas that were under Ottoman control prior to the Great War, to the First World War, have undergone a century of trying to move from their previous type of identity and allegiance to a new one that is based on the nation state. But it's only a century, and therefore factionalism is a reality in the Middle East. We have to recognize the fact, but without exaggerating it. I think we fall often into the trap of thinking that factionalism, in the form in particular of sectarianism, is part and parcel of what the Middle East is about. This is why we often talk about the Sunni-Shia divide as if this is an ancestral division that is bound to shape the nature of politics in the region. That is really not the case, because even Sunni and Shia identities are not necessarily religious. They are often communitarian, and by any means they are not the sole element of identity for a person, whether in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, or elsewhere in the region. In addition to the religious, sectarian, and communitarian aspects associated with the label Sunni or Shia, an individual has a regional identity. They have an urban versus rural one. They have a class identity, in addition to the nation state and the nationalistic identities that come into play. And therefore, it's important to realize that not unlike any other part of the world, what we're talking about is a mixed bag of identity elements that the individual pulls out of the bag as a function of circumstances. Yes, indeed, there are people who benefit from a segregation based on reductionist identities, and we often play their game when we accept the notion that these identities are all-encompassing. For example, when we accept the fact that there is a Sunni-Shia conflict in the region, it is indeed the Sunni Islamists who are reductionist in their approach, but who would like to mobilize the Sunni population who would benefit, and the Shia Islamists who also are reductionist and would like to mobilize the Shia population who benefit, because we have reduced all the other aspects of commonality between these individuals and boiled them down to the elements that are of use for this mutual mobilization. Turkey as a national community, as a national commonwealth, if you'd like, is very diverse because it's heir to an empire. The main difference between Turkey and the rest of the Ottoman realm, if you'd like, the one that came out of Turkey, is that Turkey inherited both these various identities and the state, and therefore was able to shape a Turkish identity that is overriding and that is stable and that does not go away with governments going away. Iraq emerges in the 1920s, around the same time when Turkey as a nation state was emerging. And Iraq builds what amounts to a very powerful, very convincing, very compelling national identity. But what happens in Iraq? With the so-called revolutions that happened with the Ba'ath Party coming in, the nation gets reduced to the party, and the party gets reduced to the leader. And when the leader falls, it is not just the party that falls, but also the nation, or at least the national discourse that falls. And therefore, we fall back onto factional identities. I'm glad to realize that in the case of Syria, it is not as dire, because Syrian national identity is still strong, and despite the fact that we are, by necessity, bound to look at the potential pitfalls of sectarianism and factionalism in the case of Syria, but we can also find solace in the fact that the Syrian national identity is strong and will survive, hopefully, the current crisis that Syria is facing. The role of Turkey, that has matured away from Unitarianism in terms of cultural outlook into recognizing the pluralism that is Turkey, is in showing that a strong nation state is not in contradiction with multiple aspects of identity. And this is actually ultimately when there was a lot of talk at one point or another about the Turkish model. The real Turkish model would be to show that universal values, that stress freedom, that stress individualism, that stress progress, are compatible with the notion of a strong state that is at the same time not only democratic and liberal, but also recognizes that it takes a whole range of aspects of identity to make what is ultimately the national commonwealth.